update for March 24 and 23, and I would say belated update. I'm sorry for that. Days 394 of the war, and it's at the end of the day, but I just want to give you a heads up. Nothing really important happening so far on the 25th. So let's just actually start with the financial situation, because that's just extraordinary and could affect all of us very immediately, very quickly. So I just want to provide an update. There was release of new data from the Federal Reserve on those borrowings. If you remember, I mentioned that those borrowings are indication of the stress in the banking system in the US. So as you can see, there are they have several sources: primary credit, secondary credit, and bank term funding program. There's actually something else here, but I forgot, and they're not borrowing on the secondary credit either. So the two main sort of sources of funding or temporary, we'll call it band-aid funding for the banks in the US right now is this primary credit, and as you can see, it went down over the week from roughly 153 to 110, right? However, it basically got shifted simply from this bucket, primary credit, which has a stigma attached to it, sort of like negative among the banks. If you're borrowing from there, it means you have problems, and the rest of the banks sort of shy away from you, and they don't give you lines of credit. Because banks, just for those who are not very familiar, it doesn't mean that bank is like a standalone island and just deals with the clients. Bank actively lend money to each other to cover shortfalls they may have. Some they have surpluses. Basically, it's just like one big mechanism. It's like in a way, the banks is one big living organism, like an ecosystem, and they basically channel. What they do is between the banks is they essentially like distribute excesses and of the funds that they have from depositors, and channeling those to where there is sort of gaps and there's not enough deposits to the banks. So basically, it's just like one living organism, and if you are borrowing from this discount window, which is what it is here, that means to everybody else in your sort of society, you are sick sort of animal, and everybody should not lend to you and should not deal with you. So this is like really bad sign for a bank. It means like, okay, you working dead. And so for that reason, as you can see, they shifting this borrowing from primary credit, which is part of discount window, to this newly created bank term funding program, which in my view, there's no difference in terms of stigma between those two. But anyways, somehow it's perceived that this is sort of better. But so you see the borrowing went from 11.9, call it 12, from 12 billion to 54 billion. But if you add up those two together, so it's going to be roughly 164 in both cases. So essentially, situation sort of stabilized. They're not borrowing more, but they also not sort of returning that emergency funding that they got from the government. So this is where the system stands right now. Doesn't mean that, as I said before, because as you can see, Fed funds target right now 4.75 to 5. This is old one here, 4.5 to 4.75, before the Federal Reserve increased the interest rates. So now it went to 5, which also means that the banks as a whole, they're becoming more upside down. So basically, they're becoming more insolvent. And so essentially this decision pushing the whole banking system in the US into more insolvency state. But so far, this is obviously not straight line. It's never straight line in life. So so far it's stabilized for this week. We'll see how things are developing. But basically, what sort of Federal Reserve is doing right now is, as I said before, it's saving U.S. dollar or currency and fighting inflation in that way, as opposed to saving the banking system. And partially, I was thinking about this, and I think partially why they are less concerned at this moment, because the banks that are mostly affected are the small banks and the portion of mid-sized banks that are sort of closer to the smaller ones, right? So those banks have less influence on Federal Reserve. They are less important viewed, and effectively what it says to us is that really Federal Reserve is protecting that, like, whatever, like 10, 15, 20 largest banks, and that's what they are. They probably concerned about, and they're really not concerned what's going to happen with the smaller and medium-sized banks. If they die, they die. Not big deal. So this is where it all stands. In Europe, I spoke about the Credit Suisse. Now it seems like the fire is spreading to Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank is also poorly run company, similar to Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse is definitely much worse. So let's see if they will have the same fate as Credit Suisse. But one thing is very clear: the banking system around the world is not able to deal with this interest rate increases, and that's where the whole problem, where it stems from. And if this continues on this path, there will be more banking problems around the world. Well, in the West, I guess around the world will be. At this point, we don't have a really global world, so we have regional world. That's probably a better way to describe where we're heading and where we're going to be living. And who knows, maybe we'll be even more, not even regional, but it's gonna go back to individual countries. Now let's talk a little bit about the situation, strategic situation, strategic updates, and obviously China and US is one of the important topics here. So so far, Chinese president is continuously rejecting any attempts to talk from the US president, and I think that's very strange to expect from the US that the Chinese president is going to be talking to US, because US at the same time enabling sanctions. So there were 14 more Chinese companies that were sanctioned. So from a Chinese perspective, this is declaration of the war. And the way Chinese president looks at this, they're going to fight US on, let's say, battlefield, but battlefield is not just military, it's all economic, it's diplomatic, and so on, cultural, it's everywhere, right? So the war is happening everywhere. And the TikTok hearing is example of the war through culture, right? In the culture arena. So there is nothing to talk about from the Chinese perspective. And I guess US is so misguided that because there is a strong belief that they can talk things into existence in the US in general. And I think they will be very disappointed to learn that they cannot talk things into existence. Then on China, so we see, and again, US, China, and how it's all affected. So remember, I mentioned that China managed to glue together, let's say, Middle East, or from my perspective, it's a Near East, because there was a lot of fighting between Iran and the Arab Gulf states. Essentially, Iran, it was partially controlling Iraq, partially controlling Syria, and partially controlling Yemen. So, and it was essentially waging a war with the Gulf states, and those were front lines, right? So China managed to glue that together and stop this infight. Like, well, they're not really infighting, because For those who don't really understand, Iran is ethnically completely different from Arabs. They're not Arabs. They share sort of kind of similar religion because there are also two factions within Islam. So, but really, they not sort of as close as might be perceived by by sort of people who are not familiar with the region. They actually in a way different ethnic groups and so on. But anyways, China managed to glue them together with obviously money and so on. And so at this point, Syria is also, because Syria is essentially a puppet of Iran. So they went and signed agreement with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, even supporting of them at this point. So basically, all of these warring factions or puppets of Iran, they basically agreed separately with Gulf states, Persian Gulf states, for peace. And then next step, what happens at this point, there is a consensus between all of these Arab states and Iran. Let's squeeze US out of this area. And that's why you see attacks on the US military bases in Syria and Iraq. And they probably will intensify because at this point, the consensus among all of this sort of participants in that region that US is no longer needed and needs to be removed, and it's unnecessary influence in the region. And the reason, because now they have protection of China, so they don't need protection of the US. And just to give you the economic side of this equation is for Saudi Arabia, the largest economic partner or trade partner is China. The trade is, I think, 87 billion per year versus with US only 25. And even if you include EU, which is going to be 53, so they basically both combined, or basically West versus China is equal. And given that China is buying the most important commodity of the Gulf states, which is crude oil and natural gas, and committed to it in the future, that's the most important part. They sort of side with China, and so this is essentially a very clean win for China without really, without shooting anything, without really doing much except for becoming the important economic partner and probably providing some investments and so on. So basically, they bought this region in a way away from the West, and this is what's really happening there, and that's not a good sign if there is a large confrontation, because this region may refuse providing energy resources to, let's say, to the West, and then it's going to be extreme crunch in the West, and more so in Europe than in US. Because worst case scenario, US can provide enough of energy resources to survive for itself, but for Europe, it's going to be extreme situation, extremely extreme, I would say. And this is also means that, let's say, Russia and Gulf states, if there is real confrontation, if they block supplies, it's basically going to be a question of survival for Europe specifically. At the same time, there is also a feeling around the world, and this is what is important to understand, that the West is becoming weak and weak. So there is more and more attacks on sort of individual level in, let's say, non-West countries against, in this case, I'll talk about the property of the U.S. companies, because that's what I hit the headline. I'm sure there is more of it, but there is very clear trend. So in Mexico, which is also, how to say, had very bad relationship with the U.S., especially right now. The Mexican government expropriated property. I think it's like a stone sand quarry from the company called Vulcan Materials, uh, and then in Chad, which is in Africa, there is a country in basically kind of like in the center of Africa. They expropriated oil fields from ExxonMobil, and for that I have a number is they were worth 400 million US dollars. So as you can see, there's how to say uh, sharks feel see the blood, and they start attacking not only at the governmental level, but they attacking at the actually much more important level, which is at the company level or corporate level. Just for those who how important it is extremely important because, for example, there is numbers that for the U.S. for S&P 500, because that's the companies, largest companies that have the most exposure to the world. About 50% of revenue is coming from outside of the U.S. And I'm not saying that a lot of it is coming, let's say, from Europe and Japan and so on. But if you undermine the basic level, which is natural resources supply, it will sort of trickle down to the more advanced levels into the sort of relationship with Europe and Japan. It will affect and paralyze much more than just natural resources. So, in other words, there is this magnification effect that's happening. And so you can only imagine how bad economically it will become. And that's why I mentioned that if let's say US dollar is not going to be a global currency, the standard of living and euro as well in the same way, the standard of living in the West will decline by at least 2 times and probably even more like 3 times. And this is in a way, that's why this war in Ukraine is just a small subset of the bigger war, existential war between the West and this and a group of countries that are sort of led by China, Russia, and Iran, that want to sort of change they want to have their own world order, and their world order is communist rule. It's essentially communist dictatorship. In the end, that's the end goal of all of this, which, in a way, it's return of what was happening in the 20s and 30s with the Soviet Union. Well, I guess it was happening all the time as long as Soviet Union existed, but in sort of true, how would say, really threatening way, it was really happening in the 30s and 40s, where Soviet Union openly declared that they're going to conquer the world and control the world, and it will be one communist world and one sort of communist government for the entire world. So that's sort of the how to say, the thoughts. They obviously, Soviet Union self-destructed before it was able to conquer the world. And China is repeating the same because they all programmed in the same way. It's a communist regime, and they all programmed. The end goal is to conquer the world, and so they will do the same attempt. So in a way, it's that's why it rhymes with what's been going on in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. What we're seeing right now, it's not perfect rhyme, but it's very similar. And it's in a way very similar in terms of the, in the 20s and 30s, there was Great Depression in the West, and what we sort of experiencing was this banking crisis, which is really not a banking crisis, it's a general economic crisis, but it manifests itself, first of all, in the banking system because, banking system is a mirror of the whole economy in a way. So it's just where it hits first. So this is what's going on with sort of West versus I won't say the rest of the world, but basically key players in the rest of the world. And I don't know how to call that alliance yet. Maybe someone will coin a new term for it. And we'll use that. So just to also, a little bit talking about this Chinese president visit and to Russia is just to explain how, mention how the so logistics and supply of resources works between the two countries. So I mentioned that China is really to go into the war really need to be have very reliable sources of energy and food, and so they're actively building right now roads and railroads between the two countries to connect each other. For example, where this, so we can just look at the situation with crude oil. So most people imagine that I think in the West that the majority of crude oil that goes from Russia to China is going through the seaborne transportation. It's actually not true. And the reason seaborne transportation can be easily intercepted and stopped by the West, by the UK or US fleets, and so you cannot really supply anymore to China in case of the war. So what is really what's the reality? Let's say so. Out of them, so Russia supplied in 2022 to China 67 million tons of crude oil. To convert it to the barrels, you can just multiply. I think 7.6, I believe the number that you need to multiply. And actually, I actually did multiplication. I think it's around 500 million barrels for the entire year. So, but I'll just continue with the metric tons because that's, in my opinion, much better measurement system. Meaning metric system is a much better measurement system. But so out of 67 million tons, 40 million tons went through pipelines. So as you can see, 2/3 is really unreachable to the West for the most part. I mean, unless you use obviously nuclear weapons and so on. But in a sort of conventional war, it's essentially unreachable and guaranteed ensured supply from Russia to China. And they obviously building more. There is another natural gas pipeline being built. It's called Power of Siberia 2, so sort of like Nord Stream 2. There's already Power of Siberia 1, which is sort of Nord Stream 1, and now they're building Power of Siberia 2, which is equivalent of Nord Stream 2. Once the both operational, they will supply 100 million cubic meters of natural gas to China and so on. So you can see there is this links, and out of this 40 million, 30 is directly basically linked between China and Russia, and 10 million are coming through the Kazakhstan. This is a large country in Central Asia, and if there is war, it looks like that country is going to be annexed by both Russia and China to ensure sort of essentially smooth logistical ties between the two countries and prevent any problems in supplies. But so you already see even at this point, they have very good foundation, right? Maybe it's not enough for the war situation, but it's also not zero. Let's put it this way. Then Russia has also become like number 3 exporter of chicken meat to China. Again, could be done through land. That's why they're building more roads and railroads and so on. So you see that China is also securing food supplies. Basically, all you need for the war, as I said before, is food, natural resources, and the rest. China has the rest. China has people. China has hardworking people who want to work, who obey, a high level of obedience, and so there are, and also some knowledge sort of power, and especially in tech, it's really, I think, underestimated in the West how much China gained technology-wise. And I'm not talking only about like getting Western technology because of Western companies were investing in China, and there's obviously naturally happening technology transfer. I'm talking about much more clever way how China really enriches itself tremendously, and probably, if not close the knowledge gap, it minimized the knowledge gap with the West relative to where, let's say, it was in 2000. So there were a lot of Chinese students in the Western universities who sometimes could be like 50% of the student body in the top Western universities, who went to the West, who did their, studied, got their PhD, had some experience, and they actively returning to China. The West thought that they will stay in the West, like similar to how a lot of students came from the former Soviet Union, but that's not really happening with China. They are not the same. They have extremely different culture, and they are returning in large numbers back to China and bringing all of that knowledge and power back to China, and that's how they largely closed technological gap with the West. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's close enough. It's never going to be perfect, and there is a lot of resources being pumped into the startup sector in China, in all of this entrepreneurial sector. It is pretty much extremely open in China in terms of entrepreneurship. So there's also fertile environment for these people who return from the West with knowledge to create and to be financially successful. And that's another reason why it works, and why it didn't work, let's say, in the former Soviet Union, because all of those students, they would come back to, let's say, Russia or Ukraine and Belarus, and there's nothing there. It's not fertile ground environment for entrepreneurship. It's a desert, for that matter, and so they don't return. And so Russia has a tremendous technological gap with the West, and on its own, it would never be able to wage the war, let's say, against Ukraine without backing from China. Let's keep talking about the China. So there is a sort of, how to say, Chinese government mouthpiece newspaper called Global Times, and just for that matter, for those who sort of knew, never heard, haven't missed my previous videos, every government has their own mouthpiece in terms of newspaper. It's like official propaganda sort of source, in West as well. So like, let's say, New York Times, Washington Post is official mouthpiece of U.S. intelligence agencies, right? The same is Global Times in China. The same story is in Russia. The same story is in Europe. Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, probably one of those. The Telegraph in the UK. So it's all it's the same pattern everywhere, unfortunately, and it's actually where the West is becoming more closer to the totalitarians of the China and Russia, and that's where it's losing itself. And I mentioned before, if West turns more into what China is and Russia is, then the West has no reason to exist from evolutionary perspective, right? And that's really what determines who's going to survive and who's not. And so this mouthpiece, Global Times, said this one. They said UK should be condemned for the dirty action, and dirty in quotes, of transferring shells with depleted uranium. I mentioned this, I think, previous video or the video before, that US is giving as a package with the Challenging tanks, because that's their sort of standard ammunition. That's how they made to be, how to say, excellent on the battlefield, that they have depleted uranium core in their shells. And just for those who don't know much about this, basically the this is for armor-piercing shells, so anti-tank shells that all tanks have. That the first goal of the tank is to destroy another tank, and so they have this armor-piercing shells, and those shells, all it is just essentially, think about this like arrow, thin long arrow. Even though the shell looks like big and sort of call it fat piece of sausage, but inside of it, really, what sort of call it active ingredient of that shell is really this very narrow in diameter shell, not shell, arrow. And that's what's really how the penetration is happening, how you destroy the opposing armor tank. And so the more dense that arrow is, the stronger the bigger penetration capacity is. So that's why, and uranium is one of these materials, and that's why it's being used. There's also tungsten, but uranium is actually there's higher density per whatever, call it per gram or per kilogram, whatever you want to use. Doesn't matter. But you understand the point. And so this is the most sort of powerful penetrator we have so far, and so that's the standard sort of package that comes with those tanks. And so they, that's what's being sort of transferred to Ukraine. So that's, in order for them to be effective on the battlefield, that's what they need to use. I'm not defending the point that depleted uranium is obviously environmentally harmful. It's harmful to the crews and so on. But in desperate times, you do desperate things. And to add even more, the frontal armor of Challenger tanks has also depleted the uranium in those, is exactly for that same reason, because of high density. So it helps to basically destroy this arrow that's flying. If it's just regular steel arrow or even tungsten arrow, it helps to sort of blunt it and destroy, absorb that arrow inside of it, because it's much higher density. Doesn't mean it's not penetrable. It is if there's enough energy. But essentially, this is what's happening there. But so just for those who kind of like sidetracking a little bit to discuss all of that. Now let's jump back to this strategic situation updates. So there is, I mentioned about Taiwan several times. In the fall, it looked like China had Taiwan in its pocket, because the leader of the Kuomintang, which is pro-China party, he was leading in the polls. Now he's not leading in the polls, and there's another poll which confirms the previous poll, and it says that 75% of citizens of Taiwan wanted to remain independent. So there's a 25%. But at the same time, 25% is a pretty significant portion of the population that doesn't, that actively, it doesn't mean that they just we don't want, it really means that they actively want to be with China. And the difficulty for Taiwan is that a lot of these people are in the Taiwanese military. So again, I'm very skeptical about Taiwan's ability to self-defend for its sort of desire to do so, because if you have 25% of people who actively want to be part of China, it's going to be hard. Then let's shift a little bit to China and to Japan and China. There is absolute tension that's probably not sort of recognized in the West between Japan and China. They obviously long-standing enemies, not just right now. There was a lot of atrocities done by Japanese, in China in the 30s. You're probably all aware of that. So there's a lot of hatred between the two. And so right now, what's happening is there is the Chinese outgoing Chinese ambassador in Japan. He was not granted audience by Japanese prime minister, and this is a sort of typical diplomatic ceremony where you when the diplomat ambassador leaves the country, there is this farewell ceremony audience where you just kind of like a gesture, nice gesture, before the high-ranking diplomat leaves, and special ambassador, that's a key person, and so he was rejected. So this is especially meaningful in the sort of that part of the world, because their gestures and signs and non-verbal clues are extremely much more important than in the West. In the West, it's somewhat important, but there it's, let's say, 100 times more important. So this is extreme. This is, I would say, short of their, I would say, declaration of the war. What's going on there, and also to add to this, that this is not just isolated situation. The Japanese Prime Minister, and I didn't mention actually in the previous video, Japanese Prime Minister visited Ukraine the same time the Chinese president was in Russia. So this is basically show off. Again, this is between the two countries, right? That West probably doesn't sort of, and Japan is part of the West from that perspective. But for, let's say, people who live in Europe or in the US, this is obviously not obvious because it's still, far away. It's different language and so on. So this is again, the tension is extremely high everywhere, and will especially, I would say, highlight this squeeze of their U.S. troops from the Middle East, and in addition, that on top of it is open admission by the U.S. military that Iran is weeks away from getting nuclear weapons, which at that point they probably will swarm and will remove U.S. in forcible way from the Middle East, or we will face nuclear war. And then the other question is what's going to happen to Israel, because Israel, even though it tries to sort of maintain this neutrality, but by the virtue of Iran being part of this alliance, so is like in Musketeers, one for all and all, and how to say, one for all and all for one. So China and Russia will support Iran in its effort, and Iran's efforts are very clear about Israel. There's no doubt about that. Okay, so now let's actually switch to Ukraine. Let's walk through the front line in a clockwise fashion, starting from the very north. So the situation along the state border is more or less the same in terms of there is intense exchange of artillery fire. And as I mentioned before, there is high chance of some renewed attack by Russian troops because there is there's a lot of troops within, let's say, this all area around, starting from Voronezh towards Belgorod in this area. So there is high probability of new attack towards Kharkiv, essentially. Now let's jump to the North Luhansk front line. Things here are more or less the same. Russian troops continuing the strong attacks against Avdiyivka here. This one of the bridgeheads here on this side of the river, and then also fighting continues in this large forest area in the southern section of this front line. But otherwise, there is nothing really, sort of no essential changes here. Now let's jump to the North Donbass front line. So things here are more or less the same. Russian troops, or specifically Wagner mercenaries, are attacking, but they are exhausted. Nothing, sort of no power left. So this is again opportunity if for Ukrainian side to do counteroffensive, and the best way to do it is actually attack from the flank, from the northern flank, and like here, and just go far behind, and essentially encircle all of this Wagner mercenaries and destroy this whole, at least this iteration of this, or I would call it organization at this point. This is not a this is more than just military unit. It's really organization. Um, and while I'm speaking of this, I just want to actually draw your attention for those who are interested in a tactical fighting with Wagner mercenaries, and to understand why they are very formidable, let's say, counterparty on the front line. There is a video by the battalion, I think it's called K2 battalion of this 54th brigade here, and they were fighting with Wagner mercenaries. They made a video of that, and it's a very telling, very interesting video. You can clearly see tenacity of this group of Wagner mercenaries, where we're like about less than 15 of them. Don't remember the number. Like you'll see in the video. But basically the point is they attacked Ukrainian stronghold in this kind of like a tree line that separates all the fields in Ukraine. It's just typical feature there. And there were like, very few Ukrainian soldiers in that stronghold. I don't know, look to me like less than 4, but officially it says that it's less than 8. But I didn't see, maybe didn't see enough or whatever. But the whole point is they attacked without, and this is not said in the video, but I'm just explaining, they attacked without artillery support or mortar support. And basically, from what I saw, there were like 2 or 3 Ukrainian soldiers in a trench, and they were fighting against this, roughly 15. They're pretty well equipped. They have handheld rockets and so on. They were using against Ukrainian troops. Ukrainian soldiers called artillery support, which would start working on Wagner mercenaries. And you can see there were direct hits in some groups of them and killed, but you will also see they're not retreating, they're not running, they continue attack. No matter what, they continue attack, and this explains the level of tenacity, that this is not, some kind of like people who will run away and so on. It's formidable enemy, and this is especially important given that that they don't even have any mortar support, which is not usual. This is actually, in a way, this whole situation is kind of like to extend exception from Ukrainian side, because the soldiers immediately got artillery support. It was pretty good. It was, let's say, good. Say relatively good. It's not perfect. Could be much better, but given that they use old Soviet howitzers, and there's shortage of the Western ones, so the old Soviet ones are not terribly imprecise and so on. So this is as good as it gets. Let's put it this way, because most of the Ukrainian units do not get this type of support, and that's why you see these advances of Wagner mercenaries. So you can see, remove that artillery support, and you will understand why they have been winning so far. And again, going to this battalion called K2, it's essentially standalone battalion that was attached to 54th Brigade. It's one of the better ones, and that's why it has this artillery support. It has UAV drones and so on. Most Ukrainian units don't have that level of support from the higher command, and don't have the level quality of the soldiers. So again, so you can now see, but the Wagner mercenary is more or less the same everywhere like this. So and again, if you really want to like see what's a typical situation in the battlefield, so this one is sort of more tilted toward Ukrainian side in terms of, okay, you have perfect artillery support, right? And Wagner mercenaries don't have mortar support, because this is what's typically they have. They have very strong mortar support, which is exactly what you need for this type of fights. They also have artillery support, but they also have very good mortar support, as I said before. And so if you kind of like try to recreate the normal fight, which would be typical one, because this one, as I said, is not typical, then you really start to understand why they've been winning so far. I'll put a link to that video in the video description, so you can You can check that. And this is only they release part one. They supposed to release part two, maybe part three. I don't know the whole story, but basically you'll be able to see the whole fight, which was happy ending for Ukrainian side, but for the most part, it's actually for the other units, for majority of Ukrainian troops, it's not happy ending. So so you understand perspective of the situation. So again, this is the situation in Bakhmut over whatever past most months and a half. So as you can see, it's clearly visible that Wagner mercenaries are exhausted at this point, and very likely they will not be able to really capture Bakhmut. And by the way, on this topic, I just want to explain one thing, because there is a lot of manipulation in Russian propaganda sources now, because they have problems, so they need to explain. And so what they say that Russian military controls 70% of Bakhmut, which technically is correct, but really the who controls the core of the town, that's who controls the town, and core of the town is still in Ukrainian hands. So for all of those perspectives, it's obviously Russian propaganda manipulation. And you can say that Bakhmut is still controlled by Ukrainian troops, because the core of the town is in the hands of Ukrainian troops still. Now let's. This is again the same story of Bakhmut. Now let's jump to the central Donbass front line, where things a little bit deteriorated for Ukrainian side. So as you can see, typical areas of attacks, except this time, not this time, but starting from the 18th to 19th, there were some initial success by Russian troops. And let's look what happened then. So this is, I showed you, they managed to pull as far, they captured Vesely, Krasnohorivka, and managed to get as far as Stepove. So there was fighting in this village, Stepove, which, as you can see, the situation was becoming pretty difficult for Ukrainian side. So Ukrainian side managed to counter, just local tactical counterattack, pushed Russian troops behind the railroad line. So this is where it stands right now. Ukrainian troops controlling Stepove. Basically, the railroad line is essentially a separation line for the two. And then locally, where Russian troops are continuing their attacks, they're trying to attacking towards this villages Novokalinovo and Ceramic. This is, as you can see, and then obviously very logical attack from towards this village Severna. So this is to close this, to squeeze Ukrainian troops from Avdiyivka, essentially. So far, the situation has stabilized. This is sort of the latest update on this situation. Now let's quickly check what's going on at the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are more or less the same. Russian troops continuing for reports that Ukrainian side is probing Russian side in this Arikhiv area, and sort of essentially, basically, between Arikhiv and Polohi, that's where they're expecting Ukrainian offensive. At the same time, Ukrainian president came out, I think yesterday or even today, and he said that the offensive has been cancelled because Ukraine doesn't have enough military equipment, which is by itself, it's so incompetent and inept. Like, first declare offensive, right? Which you never declare offensives. Like during World War II, World War I, that you would be shot on the spot for the treason. Just tells you like how detached, how the person is completely unfit in the wrong place. I'm not even talking about his corruption things, but just on personal intelligence level, is just he's so not there that I cannot express it even more. But so he declares the offensive, now he cancels the offensive. And that's all you need to understand about this current Ukrainian leadership and why there is a problem there. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of their sort of mental ineptness, let's put it this way. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye-bye.